Hello everyone, I'm the 12th Women's World Chess Champion Alexandra Kostyniuk, and another endgame video, a very complicated endgame, Rook and Bishop versus Rook. I must say that I'm not covering in this video course endgames with Rook and Knight versus Rook. You can find this endgame in a very nice course by Grandmaster Ivan Sokolov on Chesscom, and also there are 3 wonderful videos on the topic Queen versus Rook by George Friedel. I also suggest you to watch them, so I'm not touching these pawnless endgames because they have already been discussed on Chess.com. So let's discuss this one. Rook and Bishop versus Rook theoretically is a drawn position, but it's very hard. It's very hard to make a draw, trust me. As usual, weaker side needs to make 50 moves with no exchanges and no pawns moves. And after, on the 50th move, they can claim a draw. But we'll start with the position, the Philidor position, which is lost for the weaker side. And actually this position happens quite often in practical games. In order to win, White needs to memorize the winning method. And the winning method, well, first of all, we put our rook to the 7th rank. Then the strongest move for black here is rook f2. Then we transfer our rook to the queen side, rook d2, because rook b8 was threatening. Rook a7, we make a waiting move, and this waiting move kind of forces black to move his rook, because king f8 loses, king d8 loses also because of rook a8. So the rook needs to be moved, and unfortunately for black, it makes his situation worse. Rook d1, we're gonna see what's gonna happen with the rook on the 3rd rank in this line as well. Rook g7, transferring back to the king side again, threatening to play rook g8. Rook f1 is the best move. If black plays king f8, then rook h7, rook h8 checkmate is a threat. Rook g1 is the only move to defend from it. Rook c7 or rook b7 or rook a7, again checkmate is about to be delivered. So king g8 is the only move, but then the rook is lost here on g1. So king f8 loses after rook h7, rook f1 needs to be played. But then, and we see why it's so important to force this rook to the 1st rank, white plays a very strong move. Bishop g3. The bishop takes this square under control, and black needs to move. If he moves his rook to the 3rd rank, that's the least unfortunate position for the rook compared with f2, f1 and f3 squares. We will see later why. If the king goes to f8, then rook g4 follows, king a8, rook c4, and we see how important it is for this bishop to control this square so black doesn't check the king. Rook d1, bishop h4, and again the bishop works beautifully, controlling the square e1 and the d8 square. And black loses because this threat is unavoidable. Well, I mean, it's not unavoidable. King f8 can be played, but then rook g4, threatening to play rook, bishop e7 and rook g8. And again, it's very important that this square is under control. So black is kind of obliged to move his rook to the 3rd rank, but unfortunately it loses after bishop d6, rook e3 is the only move, bishop e5, rook f3. Rook needs to get back to protect the king. But then, a very important check to remember, rook e7 check. If king d8, then rook b7 wins, because bishop works so well here, and this square is no longer available for the rook to protect the king. So king needs to go to f8, but then rook c7, checkmate, is about to be played. King g8, rook g7, king f8, rook g4, bishop d6 is a threat. If black plays king e8, then bishop f4, covering the f file and at the same time protecting this square. And after king f8, white wins. If black tries to pin the bishop here, then rook h4. And again, the fact that white controls this g3 square helps him win this game. Quite a complicated position, quite a complicated method, and actually throughout my career I tried to memorize this whole maneuvering, but the most important thing to keep in mind that this position is winning. You need to kind of force black's rook, the rook of the weaker side, to get to the third rank, and then using your rook and your bishop and your king, of course, create all those checkmating threats. Just to let you all know very fast, the position moved one file closer to the edge of the board on the F and C files. This position is won. The technique is similar to what we've discussed. You can try to win on your own, but I will not spend more time discussing all those moves. If we shift the position closer to the edge of the board, this position is already drawn. And again, you can try to hold on and to save this position with the weaker side. One very important thing to remember, in order to win, white needs to try to get the king to e6 and play bishop e5 and get the Philidor position. But if black plays well, they need to have his rook either on the first or second rank, because if the rook is on f3 here, it loses, because after king e6, black needs to have this rook c1 with the idea rook c6 move. So if the rook is on f3, rook c3 is no longer available and it's a lost position. But with the rook on the first rank, black can save the game. And this position is drawn. And if we shift the position even further, this position is won. It's a winning position, but I've rarely seen positions like this in practical games. But the winning plan is to transfer the king to f6 and get the position similar to Philidor, but on the f file. So let's just quickly have a look how it, the rook goes to a6. It's like the perfect rank for the rook, threatening with rook a8 and protecting the king from the 6th rank, and then transferring the king to f6, and this position is already quite easily won if you know the Philidor position and the winning method. What about defending? How to save the game if you're playing with the rook? Yes, it's very complicated and you can end up in the Philidor position. In order to save your games, let's discuss two main defensive methods, which are called the easiest one. Is like the main defensive method is the so-called Cochrane defense. It can be applied, it can happen if your pieces are well placed, if your king is not yet pushed to the edge of the board, if you have time to pin this bishop and this king, and thus getting, usually these positions apply on the central files and on the 5th and 4th ranks. This is an example from the game Donchenko-Hovhannisyan, a Grand Swiss 2021 in Riga, and let's see how black held this position quite easily applying this Cochrane defense method. So the key to remember is the spin, and what makes it different from the Philidor position is that those kings are separated by two files, not by one, right? So this king is not on f5 and this bishop is not on e5 yet, but they're separated by two ranks. So when you have time to pin your opponent's bishop in this way, that method can be easily applied. Rook g2, rook a5, and the thing to remember, so when you can, you just wait, and when the stronger side tries to unpin himself, you go to the opposite side of where this king went. So it went to d4 in this game, so you go to h6. If it would have gone to d6, you would go to h4. And then, so you go to h6, that's how the game continued, and when white tries to bring the bishop and then later on the king closer, the most important thing is to play rook g5 and thus kind of free up your king. Let's see how the game continued. So pay attention that black tries to keep the rook and the king on one file, when it's possible, of course. After rook g6, it's better not to go to e5, but keep your king to e7. King f4, rook a2. So the position was turned a little bit, it changed direction, but so pieces moved little. Again, the rook and the king is on one file, and black managed to pin the king and the bishop again. And after rook b7 played king e8, and after king d5 it goes to d file, we go to f file, we go in the opposite direction. And after bishop goes away, we play rook e7, thus letting our king get away from the edge of the board if when needed. King e7, and yeah, little by little black managed to hold the game. So it's a Cochrane defense. This method is considered to be the main method to save this endgame. Let's have a look at one more example. Caruana Svidler. Actually, this game was played in the candidates tournament in 2016 in Moscow. And here, when this position appeared on the board, we see that the king was already kind of close to the edge of the board, and black decided to use the so-called second rank method. It's where the king and the rook stands like this, one square apart or together on the second rank. Well, they can stand on the third rank as well, but on the second rank it's quite effective. And when the king forces to go to the back rank, it's very important to be able to deliver a check if the king goes up, and sometimes stalemating ideas let this method work. So let's have a look how this game proceeded. So black moved his king back and forth, and for quite a while this method worked quite well for Peter Svidler, but at some point what's difficult with this method that it's so close, the pieces are so close to the edge of the board, and the stronger side keeps rotating his pieces and moving around, that sometimes mistakes happen, and even Peter Svidler was not able to hold and ended up in the Philidor position. So there are many ways to play, of course. Bishop c5, rook b7, we see that black tries to hold his pieces on the second rank, b file, which is also the second rank, counting from the a file. Bishop d6, probably rook b6 was a little bit easier, and then king b4. It's scary a little bit to put the king like this, but still. Okay, but in the game, white managed, because of Zugzwang force, black to move away from this setup, and that what caused a problem at the end. I just want to show you a very important stalemate idea that actually helps the weaker side to hold this position. So when the king kind of forces to get to the back rank and the stronger side king approaches, it's very important to have this check. So this stalemate idea often saves the game and makes this method a good defensive method. Okay, bishop c5, king b5, rook d6. So going again backward and forward. And let's just see what happened where the last mistake has been made. King to b5. So this position is still a drawn position, and there are already 30 moves that white tried to win. But rook b7, and I think that is the position where Peter Svidler made a blunder. Here king to a6 still holds this game, but instead king to a4 has been played, and we reached the Philidor position. the famous Philidor position that we discussed, just the only difference is the pieces that are turned a little bit in the other direction. And after after rook to h5, Caruana failed to find this winning method. I'm not sure if he was aware, well, I'm almost certain he knew that this position is a Philidor position, but somehow he didn't apply his knowledge, and that's exactly what's so important. I mean, knowing and being able to apply it. In order to win, you can try it at home, you can try to win on your own, but again, I will go very fast and show you this winning technique. Rook b2, rook h3, bishop f2, protecting the square, and little by little with this important check, black loses, king a5 loses due to rook b7. After king e3, rook b6, again this check, and bishop to e3, covering this third rank and taking this square under control. So that's how this game should have ended, but instead Caruana failed to find this winning technique, and here rook b2 was still winning, but after bishop to f6 the game ended in a draw. Actually, I've had these endgames 4 times throughout my career in over-the-board games, and 3 times for stronger side, once for weaker side, and I scored 3.5 out of 4, so not a bad score. My latest example is from the Russian Super Final 2020. I was playing against a young and promising player, and actually I was almost certain she would just demonstrate me this defensive methods and we would agree on a draw. For example, here she could have played king d2, and after king d4 played rook d7, pinned this bishop, after rook a2, king d1, and we have this Cochrane defensive method on the board. After king e5, king c1, and so on and so on. When bishop retreats, rook d2 is played. But in fact, she played king b2. It's always tricky when you bring your pieces closer to the edge of the board. As we know, you should try to stay in the center. So we moved a little bit. And here she made a blunder. She played king to a3. Any move to the first rank are still okay and hold a draw, but king a3 loses. I played king to c4. It's not a Philidor position, and another thing that I should mention, although this Philidor position is so difficult, but usually stronger side loses faster with making some mistakes, and it's not really necessary to demonstrate all the winning moves in order to win. And this one is a good example. Somehow white ended up in the position with the king and the rook are so badly placed on the edge of the board that black has 2 winning methods here. The first one, here I've never seen such a winning method before, and I failed to find it in the game. It's quite easy. The king can go to b5 and white is in Zugzwang. Rook b1, king a5, and because of this checkmating threat, quite an unusual checkmating pattern, white loses, because if she goes to a1, I make a waiting move and it's a Zugzwang. It's a checkmate on the next move. One more try is to give this check, but unfortunately for white, I would take with the bishop, because after king takes b5, it's a stalemate, but bishop takes b5 wins the game. In the game, I didn't see king b5 because it's so unusual. I found another winning method, which works as fine. So I played rook c2, rook c3. Then, I don't know why she didn't repeat the moves. She could have tried to play rook b1, but I think my idea was just to transfer the rook somewhere there. She played king a5 and I played rook h3. King a4, bishop b5, and I won the game. Again, rook and bishop versus rook are generally drawn endgames, but it's quite hard For the weaker side, you should be able to apply those two defensive methods, the so-called Cochrane defensive method and the second rank method. It's up to you which one to try and to apply it in practical games. And if you're a stronger side, of course, try to shoot for this, for setting up this Philidor position, and it would be nice if you remember this winning technique, this winning method, although it's quite a complicated one. Good luck in your games and see you in the next videos.